Stephanie, I really want to start with you because obviously you've had a very public career and you had to put your voice out there. So, how did you put your voice out there and then parlay that voice to advocate for others?
Ooh, okay, first, just before we get started, I noticed there was somebody in the room that didn't get noticed, and I want to notice. Susan Baines is here, she's new city councilor in White Rock. So, yeah, you know, the first time that I had to advocate for myself because of a lack of accessibility and my disability, it was hard, and it made me feel weak and vulnerable. And honestly, I felt that way for a really long time doing that. I did everything in my power to overcome barriers that were there, right? I would plan ahead and take somebody with me and plan ahead again and have a backup plan to make sure that I never had to ask somebody to help. That's a societal thing. We've made it the obligation of individuals to overcome barriers that we put in place for them. And that's something we really have to think about. But I think a shift happened at some point. At some point, I realized that every time I did speak up, that somebody else didn't have to. And that I realized that I had power, I had strength, I had privilege, and that with that, I had to make some change. And I realized that I wasn't asking for myself, I was challenging norms that existed, that we weren't designing for everybody. We were designing for the average white male. And I think I recognize that using your voice for yourself is courageous, but that using your voice for others is a responsibility. And I felt that responsibility really deeply. I think how I learned that was very random in my career path. Things happened that I just said yes to, and it came about in a way that was very random. It was not planned. But I think I've now taken it about as far as I can. And as elected official, and now as an appointed official, as one, you know, the first in the country, I think now where I recognize that I am in and have been in the rooms where decisions are made, and that my being there, even if I didn't say anything, made a difference. And I think that that's what women bring more so than men, and no offense to the men in the room, there are fantastic men in this room, but we bring something different to the table as women. We bring something different to the table when we show up differently, when we feel differently about issues, when we think deeper about who's not in this room, and who do I have an obligation to speak up for. So through my career, advocacy for women and advocacy on disability taught me that inclusion doesn't happen by accident. It really is something that happens because of intention and because of who is in the room. And it's true of many things, not just accessibility. But it happens because somebody was willing to use their voice. And whether they started that and did that because it was for themselves and for ambition and their career, and all of that is good and okay, or whether it was because they saw somebody that wasn't there. I think that was sort of my path.
Amazing. I think the segue now is to Anita, because I sense that you felt you had a responsibility to be a voice and be at the table. And did you know you were going to become a leader? And did you know that you'd have to face all these barriers because we're still fighting for equal rights, you know?
Thank you for asking me to speak. Koskuya, Ushya, Danatotia, Chiona Jasini, Gutsama Jasini, Tagishkwan Jasini, and my English name is Anita McPhee. I just told you, good day, my name is Koskuya. I'm from the Wolf clan. My family is Gutsama, and my family is Tagishkwan. Just by saying that alone is a power statement. Because as Indigenous women, Indigenous people, we come from a matriarchal society. My mom was a wolf, my grandmother was a wolf, my great-grandmother, and we can trace my lineage right back to the first grandmother. Isn't that amazing? So basically everything that you've been taught about Indigenous people not being complex, sophisticated, or smart, that's all from a colonial playbook. And it's from a male's playbook. And you know, as an Indigenous woman, I've had to face many, many barriers, more than any other race. And I don't mean to disrespect anybody in this room, but it's true. Because when people came here, we were an invisible people. They didn't even see us. In fact, you didn't see us because they didn't want you to see us. You know, when our lands were dispossessed and taken away, that's another way for stealing. We were put on the side. And if you notice, all the reservations are not within city centers, within towns, within settlements, because they didn't want colonizers to see us or settlers, because they didn't want you to know what was happening. But you know, in the words of Marie St. Clair, in order to get to reconciliation, we must tell the truth. And the truth is that I've had a lot of barriers. You know, starting at 14 years old, like my dad told me I was going to be a leader. Just like I could relate to the comedian. Sat me down and said, you're going to be a leader one day, and you need to know, and just gave me the whole spiel. And I did become a leader. But it didn't come without a lot of barriers. And education was one of them. I was 14 years old and forced to leave my family, my community, my mom and dad. I lived in 7 different homes from 14 to 17. I didn't know that was instability until I was older. I didn't know that you could feel abandoned. You know, a lot of these things. But because the government doesn't care about Indigenous kids or Indigenous children, they said there was not enough kids to build a school. And so that's one of the barriers that I had to overcome. That's discrimination. And you know, I had to deal with that at age 14, not understanding why people were criticizing the way I spoke, the way I looked. And last time I checked, I was attractive. And you know, saying things like the only reason you're pretty is because you're half white. I was raised Indigenous. My mom and dad are Indigenous, my late parents. And then it carried on into university. You know, I got my social work degree, my law degree by the time I was 27. And I graduated with accolades. But I wouldn't stand for the Crown's rules. And I wouldn't stand to become a lawyer because I couldn't uphold laws that held our people down and that continued to oppress our people. The Indian Act that stripped Indigenous women of their status, which happened to my mom and my grandmother. And that means their kids didn't receive status, which means you couldn't live in your community. You had to leave. So they're like, oh, you're like everybody else, but not really. Not really. You're still an Indian in other people's eyes. And the things they used to say to us, the racial barriers. So, you know, just by saying I'm a mom, a single mom, and I'm an Indigenous woman, that's 2 barriers right there. You know, so I want to end this by saying, you know, I got to recognize my own power. I recognized it a long time ago. And I realized that, you know, everything we've been told as women, it's not true. We are powerful people. And right now in the world, we need this empowerment. We need this power. Look at what's happening to all the people of indigenous people and people of color in different countries. It's being controlled by irresponsible, violent men. And this needs to stop. And we need to recognize that we're not the minority, we're the majority as women. So I just really want to thank you. And I want to say I apologize to Stephanie a long time ago when her and I sat across the table. And I was being a really mean negotiator on behalf of my people. Because I was a former president. I'm a former president of 4,000 Tahltan people for 6 years. I was the leader of my nation. And her and I sat across, but we were both fierce. So I just want to say Madu Cho means big thank you, and Nerish Cha means much love.
Paulina, that was such a great answer, and thank you for your honesty. Sorry, Anita. Paulina, you and I have known each other for a long time, and I know that you were the CEO of the Forum of Women Entrepreneurs. And you taught me a lot, too, about being entrepreneurial. Tell us why that's so important for independence and for agency with women. And then let's also talk about the gender gap for entrepreneurs, because I know you've talked a lot about that.
Oof, do we have all day? I am really curious, how many women here in the room identify as an entrepreneur right now here today? So many. And how many are kind of curious about it, maybe dabbling, thinking about it? Okay. And then how many would say they really, they consider themselves really curious and community oriented? Okay, almost every hand is up in the room. So I want to tell you that you definitely have an entrepreneurial mindset, even if that might not be your full-time path. So my experiences have kind of been woven together around entrepreneurship and supporting women in both starting and growing businesses. And what I've come to really experience from that is that, one, there's no one path of what it looks like, and that, two, one of the most important pieces that we can actually give ourselves is the permission to embrace following curiosity and opportunities, even though we don't know where they will lead us yet. Because I think still, even in 2026, when you Google entrepreneur, there is a certain image that pops up, and it's either a guy in his 50s wearing a suit or a guy in his 20s in flip-flops in a basement in front of a computer. It's usually one of those two, even though I know in this room, we can probably name so many incredible business owners and entrepreneurs. That is still not what all the success stories that we hear and see. To your point, Robin, in terms of the numbers, less than 2% of significant funding goes to women entrepreneurs, yet locally in communities, nearly 70% of small businesses are being run by women. And they are vastly over-investing into their team members and into their communities, and are usually the true backbone of what community means. I grew up around entrepreneurs, but they would never have called themselves that. My family immigrated when I was a couple years old from Poland. We then went back and came back and forth, but my parents were entrepreneurs out of necessity. They also didn't speak the language when they first came here and just tried to make ends meet through however and whatever they could. And I think often a pathway that women will take into entrepreneurship is either necessity or solving a problem that really needs to be solved. And here's where I think our superpowers can really shine, because as we have all talked about, the world was not made by us and it was not made for us in so many ways. And so in that way, we're the perfect people to actually fix so much of what is broken, because we daily experience the things that are not working. I was chatting with Tina beforehand, and we were reflecting on how so many of us are in these rooms and having these conversations, and yet so little feels like it is changing. And one of the things that brings me a lot of hope is the opportunity to always share that there are communities and there are resources that exist out there to support along this journey, the journeys of entrepreneurship. And so if anyone out there who had raised their hand who is an entrepreneur or is wanting to pursue opportunities around that, wants to connect to get plugged into places and spaces where you can get access to that, I'll put a plug for that. Happy to chat with anyone after.
Thank you for that. I think it makes sense now to ask Cal about, say you're an entrepreneur and you're looking for money, and say you're a female entrepreneur, why it's so important for us to have that financial independence besides just having our own bank account.
Okay, good question. So,
You alluded to it at the very beginning about how important it
yeah,
is to, it's not just numbers, it's empowering yourself with those numbers.
yes. So, I never grew up thinking I would be the primary breadwinner in my family. I actually married a man that checked every box. He was educated, responsible, stable, handsome, and like many women, I assumed my life would follow a predictable path. But life happens. And that path isn't always predictable. There's health shifts, there's family responsibilities change. And there is a point where I had to fully lean into my career in a way to strengthen my family's financial foundation. It was a very difficult season for us. I already had advocated for my education as a young mother. I relentlessly worked so hard to earn my designation while raising my boys. And stepping into that responsibility again, it created pressure. And it was emotional pressure, financial, personal. But we know difficult seasons don't define us, right? They only refine you. And when you walk through them with resilience and faith, you come through it like so much stronger than you ever imagined. So that experience reshaped how I view money for women. So for me, financial agency it comes down to 3 life anchors. The first, financial independence is a skill set. Financial independence is not a backup plan. It is a life skill. It's not about expecting failure in your marriage. It's about being capable in life. So when a woman understands money, she gains quiet confidence. She gains choice. And that quiet confidence changes how you show up at work, at home, and in your community. Second one would be stability protects your dignity. Many of us come from cultures where we are taught to prioritize everyone else before yourself. But financial vulnerability, it's real, right? Especially during divorce, widowhood, economic disruptions. And money doesn't guarantee happiness, right? But it protects our dignity. So it gives you options. It gives you, knowing your net worth, knowing what assets you have in your name, right? Even knowing and understanding your own household finances. So hope is not a strategy. Preparedness is. The third one I would say is independence. It creates balance, not division. So, and this is very important culturally because financial agency doesn't mean rejecting partnership. It means entering partnership from strength, right? So being self-empowered enough that if something was to happen, you are okay. And that independence inside a relationship, it creates balance. Balance creates respect. So in closing, I didn't plan to be a primary financial anchor in my family, but becoming financially strong It gave me something way more deeper than an income. It gave me clarity, it gave me confidence, it gave me choice. And it gave my family stability. So I believe every woman, regardless of your background, your culture, what stage you are at in your life, you all deserve that strength and stability.
Cal, thank you. That was lovely. Okay, Johnny, you're 2 months into a new job. Congrats. It's always hard navigating a new role and trying to make your mark because you have to rebuild relationships. You got to build trust with your circle at work. How's it going?
It's going well. Thank you. And thanks for the opportunity to be here today. Excuse me. The advice I received early on was be a bitch. Not coming into this job. But for 20 years, I worked in municipal government, and I was told, be fierce. Make them fear you. Be tougher. And I remember the day that I stood in front of the leader who had probably for the 10th time told me this. And it just came out. I said, I'd rather be respected than feared. And I didn't understand what respected meant at that time in my career. But I knew that the other option didn't align for me. I came to learn a lot more about being a curious leader, a lot more about being a humble leader, a lot more about being somebody who actually showed up with presence. So I left municipal government, and I had the privilege of working with Squamish First Nation and then with the Tira Women's Resource Society. And you can imagine my surprise as a proud queer woman that I was a misogynist. Internalized misogyny is a real freaking thing. I learned that in the colonial construct of municipal government. I learned that working in constructs that existed in order to colonize. The irony is that I'm in New West now, the original colonizers in BC, is not lost on me. I worked at the Vancouver Park Board. The reason, the origin story for the Park Board was to remove the Indigenous settlement out of Stanley Park. I worked in these environments and I had no idea the impact they had on me. When I left and I realized there was a different way of doing it and that it actually aligned for me, I realized that that is how I wanted to show up as a leader. So, people ask me, why would you go back into municipal government? Good question. I chose New West because it's progressive. I chose New West because over the last 10 years, I've seen more women firefighters in general, more women in politics in general, more queer people have voices in general. In municipal government, I've seen more diversity, and I have hope. I know it may not be a financial strategy, but it is my leadership strategy. I have hope that we can change municipal government and any sector that we work in by showing up as our authentic selves. So the first thing that I had to do was to not go back to being a bureaucrat. I'm going to tell you that's kind of tough when you work in a bureaucratic setting, so I invite every single one of you to call me on it, and I have a good support group who calls me on it when that happens. And part of that is the language we use. Language matters. Every chance I get, I question the language we use. And quite honestly, municipal language is not accessible. If we can't understand the reports, why would we be interested in the reports? I didn't know this until I left municipal and then came back. The other part to that is actually doing our own work. I've spent the last couple of years really questioning all of the things that I had learned, like the internal misogyny, like the homophobia, even as a queer woman that I owned, the biases, the privilege, all of the things that I walked with in leadership. I almost want to cry because not everybody gets the opportunity to leave their career and go freaking learn. And first about yourself. And the humility that I experienced working in a women-serving organization and not understanding what it meant to be a woman with voice was huge. It was impactful. So I come back into municipal government and I understand that change is something that people have challenge with. And what I learned was that it's not the people, it's the systems. And so as the new CAO, and recognizing that other CAOs in other municipalities who have names similar to mine decided that they would fire 400 people to make change, I believe that systems actually make change. I don't think we need to fire people. I think that people are kind of innately good, and that if the systems are set up to have them be successful, then we can actually do good. But it's the systems that fail us. And so I come into this job wanting to build relationships. Relationships are systems that are super important. Wanting to be a clear communicator and to have systems of communication so that people understand what we're doing and why we're doing it. And then to have systems that can align us to the mission. And again, I go back to the work starts in here. So if I'm an internal activist for myself, I can actually be an internal activist within, wait for it, government.
I loved how you talked about language. Is there a lot of high level? Let's go high level. Like we're gonna ever go low level? Like it's the worst expression in the world. Okay, Sarah, you come from a communications background. You are also a leader. How do you communicate your brand as a leader, especially for future entrepreneurs and current entrepreneurs?
Okay, so I'm going to admit something a bit uncomfortable. I bristle at the term personal brand. I didn't tell you that when I was told I'd be asked this. And I think that part of it for me is what sits hard for me is that I think that often when we hear personal brand, we think that it's something we need to perform. And so all of us have probably experienced that in one way or another. And I remember when I was first appointed to a leadership position, and the extremely fierce and powerful woman who hired me into that position sat me down and she told me, I need you to know what you're walking into. And I need you to know what the executive feels. And there was a split on the executive around this hiring decision. And there are people on the executive who believe that you shouldn't have this job because you're a small young woman. And she's like, I need you to know what you're walking into. And so you can bet I walked in, and you can bet, Lenya, I took up space, right? So I did, and I was able, but part of what that meant is I learned a particular way of performing what I thought a leader was. And it was a performance that was accessible to me as a white, cisgendered, able-bodied presenting woman. So it was much more accessible to me than it is to many people. But it wasn't really true to me. And so I think I performed a brand. But then, interestingly, I didn't start my career in comms, but I did, over time, move into communications. And it was partly because I believe so fiercely in bringing people together. And when I was reflecting on this, I thought, hey, well, but brand is not actually about performing. If you think about the brands that you're committed to, even if you think about the brands like Minerva or DIVERSEcity, right? It's about a feeling and a relationship. So I kind of feel like even reflecting on this question, I'm having a slightly different relationship with the term, because ultimately a brand needs to be about listening and being in relationship. And if you ultimately are doing that in a personal way, then you need to be understanding who you want to be as a leader. And I can say that once I stopped trying to perform what I thought leadership was supposed to be for somebody who looks like me, and stopped trying to squeeze myself into that particular definition of leadership, which is 100% defined by a particular model of male leadership. And I spent much of my career in government, so it's a very, very small little box that you need to squeeze yourself into. Once I stopped trying to squeeze myself into that little tiny box, I was actually able to have a lot more impact, including, ironically, in government, sometimes to the dismay of the deputy minister. But I think I was able to be a leader and achieve make better impact for folks, and it just felt better. So for me, personal brand, it needs, if you're starting with a feeling, it needs to start with a feeling for you. It needs to be personal to you. And if you can find a way to express your leadership, whether that's as a formal people leader or just as a human in these spaces, then that's when it's going to be really powerful and authentic.
I want to continue the conversation about brand, but I do want to get to you as someone who's younger than me and younger than a lot of us here. There is a tendency for younger generations to not want to go into leadership. How can we encourage that and discourage them from having that attitude?
First of all, is there any next gen in the room today? Next gen? Yeah, I see you. Good to see you, friends. No, I love this question, and you can be in this too. We're all in this. It's all good. Oh my gosh, it's okay. What I find interesting about young women right now is that they're not, they want to be part of the status quo, or they want to be part of that group, but also we're challenging how the status quo is actually made, the architecture of it. And I've seen that throughout all my different hats that I wear in teaching at the UN, or even as an entrepreneur. Young people, young women, we're asking 3 really, really great questions, and that's who's developing the budget? Who is designing the room? I wrote this down so I won't rant. Who's setting the agenda? Who defines success? These are all the questions that I've seen young women asking in these rooms. And in our generation, I feel like the convo is shifting from, can we have access to the room? Are we building inclusive environments, which is all great things, to how can we actually define and design systems that involve us there in the first place, either it be for youth or for women. So it's less so about inclusion, and more so how can we build the space with that already in there. And one example for you I have right now at the UN, one of the things I'm doing is building youth representation, or even just young women in leadership rep at the UN. And the conversations are shifting way beyond how do we involve youth, but more so about how do we build policies now with youth already at the table, with young people already at the table. So I think it's very clear that it's no longer about inclusion and no longer about how do we get women in the room. It's moved way beyond that now. It's more so about how can we build now that you're here and with you. So to answer your question and to kind of round that off, if I were to reflect back on my decade, oh my gosh, it's been a decade. Oh my gosh, okay, over my decade of experience in leadership and in policy advocacy, I would tell my younger self to be bold, take my parents' resiliency into scope, and also don't be challenged and or feared by what's ahead. Always look for optimistic ways, and there's always a third door. That's what I would say. There's always a third door.
Donnie, I want to get your response to this, because you're obviously in a very senior role. What do you think about what she just said, and what changes need to be made to get younger people to the leadership table?
Oh, you know what? I love the questions being asked. Who's responsible for the budget? That, to me, we know that decisions are being made based on colonial constructs, based on patriarchal leadership, not based on what's important to invest in people, what's important for community. How are we actually understanding from community what's important to them? For so many years, we wouldn't even talk to them about what was important. We would just say, hey, no, we're going to deliver this. That's the whole nothing about us without us notion is something that comes to the table, and the same thing goes for the younger generation. If we want to make politics accessible, language matters. We need to have accessible language, and what we're talking about matters. And that's where the conversation comes from community, not from necessarily those folks who think they know better.
We want to take some questions from you now. If there's a particular question you have for one of our panelists, Neelam she's our roving reporter, and she's going to take your questions. We have one at the back there.
Thank you so much for sharing your voice and your experiences. My question to anyone on the panel is, for many of you, you've gone through the channels. You've been frontline, you've moved your way up, you're all sitting at very high positions in your own businesses, or in community serving organizations. How do you bring along other women with you so that they are also climbing the ladder and experiencing that growth?
This little light of mine.
No, I'm
Fair enough, I'm not going to sing. You don't want me to sing. It's very intentional. I did this as a minister. I do it in my community and volunteer life. I do it in my professional life as a politician, encouraging other young women to run for office, giving people, but actually giving women permission. Uh-oh.
unsure. It's okay, the staff
Okay.
have said it's okay.
Oh. Okay. So I'll keep talking over the alarm because, you know, it's fun. But I think it's about asking and giving permission, because a lot of women probably want to do more, to grow, to lead, but they ask themselves a question all the time, like, am I capable? We talk ourselves down as women, and men don't do this. And I'll invoke former Premier Christy Clark here with this one. She always said to us, when looking for candidates, when you approach a man, they say, what took you so long? When you approach a woman, they say, oh, well, I don't think so because I have all these other responsibilities and I'm not sure that I have the skills. We have the skills. We have the capacity, and we need to be at the table. And if we aren't willing, as again, Christy would say, if not you, who? Right? If you're not willing to step in, and that's to say, you know, there's already all sorts of reasons why you might not want to do that, and that's fine. But if we aren't willing to do it, then how do we expect the change to happen? And we have to actually intentionally bring women in. So in my own teams, I elevated women. In my own teams, I encourage women to take steps they're not comfortable with. And try to impart on them, because they'll ask me, well, how did you do it? You're so confident. Like, not really. I'm the biggest, I have the imposter syndrome on a regular basis. The reality is, though, you just have to take the step and expect that it will be okay. You will learn something, and what's the worst thing that can happen? So I think it's just about being really intentional.
Is that a fire alarm because we're all so hot and going through menopause? Is that what this is? Because I felt our temperature rise too.
It's a false alarm. False alarm.
Thank you. Next question.
Anvil staff.
Thank you, Anvil staff.
Anita wants to answer this question as well, so go for it.
Can you hear me? Okay, now, so as Indigenous women, because we have to wear multiple hats, like of every woman, but for us, it's like even more. So, you know, I would say I'm a single mom, then I'd be like, I'm an entrepreneur, I'm a cooking show host, I'm over here being executive director for this nonprofit, you know, also being an advocate nonstop. But one of the things we did was we created an advocates group called our Mom and Auntie group. And which means, because as advocates, as women, especially Indigenous women advocates and women advocates, it seems nobody takes care of us. And so what we did was we created some space where women could just rely on each other, maybe go have a nice meal, maybe go to a play, or even go to a show, or even just sit around in the living room and work on what our vision is for the future, like our vision boards. But it was just going back to, you know, supporting each other like how we used to in our community in our living rooms, in our spaces, and creating that space to do it where a woman could just do like we did earlier, just feels good to just sit here. And that's why we created the Mom and Auntie group, because we found that as advocates, there was just not enough support.
We've got a question here in the back.
Thank you so much for those wonderful words. Having an advocacy group is super important for a mom, as myself. However, sometimes you're able to get through all of that, those hurdles, and you still want to go ahead and be the best version of yourself and set up your own business. My question is around those who might not necessarily be advocates. However, they might actually be setbacks. Sometimes you face opposition from even amongst ourselves who are women. I mean, you would expect that we will know way better, but sometimes we're actually our own impediments. What would you advise women who are trying to get past all of those hurdles, but they still have to respond back to those who are still seeing them as, you know, way below? What would be your advice for the ones who want to go out there, but they have a lot of setbacks? How do you respond to them?
I think I'd like to answer that question. I will tell you that I did not have great female mentors when I was a journalist. In fact, I got fucked by the women more than I did by the men. The men would sexually harass you and basically say you're objectify us, but the women would be the ones that didn't give me the raises, or would say, "Oh, you're single, you don't have any kids, you should work Christmas Day," and I'm like, "I have a family." So what I did was I found champions instead of mentors. You need someone who's going to say, "I'm going to take you to the table. I'm going to take you here. I'm going to invite you to this networking event. I'm going to introduce you to the banker, the accountant, the lawyer." That's what you need to look for. And I will tell you, I have a cabinet of female friends now who are not in my business or were never journalists, and they're the ones who've taken me to every table and helped me be more successful. So that's what you have to look for.
Okay, I want to add to that because I love the champions piece. And then the added piece is around finding sponsors, so people who will talk about you behind your back and in rooms that you're not in to put you forward for things. And while not all of us may be in positions that we have opportunities to do that, those of us who certainly are, I know, do and should and can do that more. I think we can all do that for one another in really small ways. And I have like a laundry list of recommendations I always have for how we can support women-led businesses. Yes, we know that every dollar we spend, we're investing in the future and in the leadership we want. And so it comes to our own purchases, who are we buying from? But then also when we're in community or when we're in our companies or in workplaces, asking who's running the catering business that we are procuring for, who owns the cleaning services company who come and services the building. When we're buying clothes, where is it made and where does it come from? And these seem like such small questions, but to the point of where is the budget and who is setting it, it can start causing a ripple effect. A few years ago, I challenged myself for the full year to only read books that were written by women, and then a specific portion of books written by women of color. And the category I had the hardest time finding the volume of was in the nonfiction business leadership category. 99% of books in that category are written by men. And I wanted different voices and to hear different ones. And I think it starts from that initial spark of, well, wait, who do we put forward and who are we absorbing and learning from and how do we share around that? And so sometimes we have formal opportunities when someone goes, "Hey, who do you recommend for that job?" And sometimes we can do it in informal ways too.
I just wanted to add to that. When I was done leadership, and I was a single mom, so young kid, like she was only 7 years old. All my counterparts, they finished their leadership. They had 6 businesses. They were consultants. They all moved on to all these powerful positions. I moved on to having a home business or trying to be a consultant, communications, and going to the food bank, you know, and so I started educating myself, and I learned about lateral violence. Lateral violence is the intention to be mean. And, you know, and it means when people are oppressed, they don't have any power, they take it out on each other. We do that as Indigenous people, as people of color. We do that as women, sometimes in the LGBTQ community, but we turn on ourselves. And what I did is I end up taking that opportunity that was killing me because I had a lot of lateral violence as an Indigenous woman leader. And I turned it into a business. And that's what I teach right now, is about lateral violence prevention. So turned it around.
We have a question over here.
Thank you. So my name is Katie. I am the incoming CEO of Unity. We provide services and supports to people with developmental disabilities. So Stephanie, thank you for all your support over the years. And the question is for you, but it is also for everybody. People with developmental disabilities often don't have the ability to speak for themselves. And so we've talked a lot today about finding our voice. But how do we make sure that people with developmental disabilities are also included in this conversation so that they too have that rightful place in their communities?
It's a really good question. And I know the work Unity does and how powerful it is, so do what you're doing. And I use Unity and the self-advocates of Semiahmoo as an example across the country and internationally about how to do it right. But I'm going to be really brutally honest right now. There are a lot of people in this room today that will not be comfortable with the idea of a person with an intellectual disability having a place at the table. That's an unconscious bias that people hold. I don't think people do it intentionally, and I don't think people do it maliciously. But it's not just about people with intellectual disabilities, about people with other disabilities too. One of the things that I'm spending the most time on in my role is challenging people's perception of what disability is, what accessibility is, and why it matters. And the reason I have to do that over and over and over again is because we are uncomfortable with disability. We are uncomfortable with anything that is different. Anything that we don't understand ourselves, we just don't want to talk about it. We don't want to deal with it. And so the thing we have to do, and the thing that every person in this room can do to help ensure that we can bring the voices of people with intellectual disabilities into business, into community at all levels. And let's be clear, it can be at all levels. There is a young woman with an intellectual disability who just passed the bar in Spain. She is a lawyer. So we need to take a moment in our lives to question why we have the beliefs that we have about people with disabilities, and be willing to open our minds and to challenge others when we see them say something or do something that is based in that place of fear. So.
Hi, everybody. My name is Zara Ismail. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm the CEO at Vantage Point, which is the nonprofit organization that strengthens and supports nonprofits across BC. One of the things that we talk a lot about is about workforce, and the workforce in the nonprofit sector is primarily made up of women and people from equity-deserving communities. It's part of the reason I think a lot of us believe that the nonprofit sector's wages are lower, and that's a systemic issue. What I want to ask about specifically, though, is about support for women returning to work. I know a lot of you on the panel have talked about how it's challenging being a single mom or working and also having a family. There's a biological difference for people who give birth, female or gender diverse people. So what is it that we can do not only to create a seat at the table, but create a table that accommodates and supports women who do have multiple priorities? Because I know, like I can say, looking around the room, I see so many women who have gone through this experience and who have senior level roles, and most of us are having to give more than we have inside our tanks. And it has to come from somewhere, right? And I think a lot of the time the sacrifice comes from family so that we can continue to measure up to the men that we're being pitted against at the workplace. So I want to know, how can the table shift?
I love that you've asked this question. And at Coast, we were just having this debate this week around how we talk about the representation of women, including in leadership in nonprofit, because it's a double-edged sword. I would say that the first thing we need to do is talk about it. So I'm a parent, I'm a mother. I faced discrimination when I had my children, to the point where the ombudsman was involved, and it led to a whole thing and a public apology with the board, and the CEO was exited. And anyways, I get a bit fierce about this. Robin could feel my energy. And I would say that in my experience as a woman, like as a woman leader, it's exceptionally short-sighted to think that because somebody has given birth or adopted a child or has a caregiving role, possibly on the other side as well as aging for other members of their family or parents, that somehow that is going to make them less able to deliver in the workplace. I think we need to challenge that. So for me, it becomes whether you're a colleague, whether you are in a position of power, or whether you're just thinking about how you approach your work, we need to focus on what does value look like, what does contribution look like, and that doesn't necessarily shift just because somebody has or hasn't given birth or has caregiving responsibilities. I just feel like it doesn't make any sense. And if you take a look at the data, it's not there, right? Like women who become parents don't stop contributing simply because they've been away. They might be away on leave, but then they come back. So there's certain specific policy tools that if you are in a position of power, you can advance. I've advanced those in my workplace, and there's great work of some organizations around, including Matern, for people that don't know, a great organization that can help with that. But I think that part of it, and before you get to the policy, you need to actually challenge the belief, because the only reason that belief exists is because it serves a certain model of leadership that was baked in a white patriarchal model that no longer exists, right? So like there's no reason that you need to do that. So I think for me, the first step is to challenge it and ask where that's coming from, and then ask people what they need. There are some people who start a family and want to take a step back. There's some people who want to take a step back and it has nothing to do with whether or not they've given birth. There's some people who start a family and that lights a fire in them and they want to lean in. Like all of those should be okay. And to me, it's about taking a step back from the box and actually asking people what they want.
If I could just add to that, and I'm going to give a shout out to Atira, and I know the new CEO is in the audience. At Atira, 80% of the staff came with lived experience. Lived experience is not something that we give credit to. You don't have a PhD in indigeneity. You should. We don't have PhDs in parenting or mothering. And those things, once recognized, actually should be carrying the value that we know they carry. And many organizations rely on that lived experience to be actually the superpower.
Okay, I want to add a bit of a tongue-in-cheek answer to this. I was last year invited to moderate a manel. So it was a panel of all men, specifically on the topic of like, how do you balance it all? And so the invitation was to ask men the questions that women always get asked, which, like, if you're going traveling, oh, did you like freeze all the meals for them? Or, which I've gotten asked by my mother-in-law every time I travel. Like, no. Have you heard of DoorDash? Or like, who's babysitting the kids tonight if you're out at an event? Their father. But the invite was to put together a panel where I moderated and asked the men all the questions. And so I went out to my community of women. I said, what are the most absurd questions that you've gotten asked over the years? And I asked them these questions, and they were there for it. And one of the men, just in the middle of the panel, truly broke down. It was a very vulnerable moment. And what he said was, this is so goddamn uncomfortable, and I cannot believe that I've never known that this is what you are actually experiencing and that this is how it feels. And I can get in all sorts of rages around, how can you not know that that is what we are experiencing? How are you not seeing that? And I had to kind of talk myself off the ledge of, well, I guess if you don't see it, I can't blame you for not thinking about it and trying to solve it. And so I now ask just, men in my life, men at work, guy friends, I will ask them these questions, and sometimes they just snicker and laugh at me, but I'm just standing there waiting for an answer, and then they realize I'm seriously asking them, and then I will say, yeah, well, if you were my girlfriend, I would have been asking you that, or she would have been asked that in a work circumstance, and it just brings it to the forefront. It names it in a bit of an absurd way, but in a way that we all experience it. And I don't want us as women to have to shoulder the work of this. I want to be very clear. We should not be the ones responsible for changing this, and we have something here in it. And so that's my tongue-in-cheek way that I now approach it, which also gives me a bit of satisfaction. Like, it kind of is like a bit of a
I think it's the right way to approach things. I love that anecdote. What a great story. We have time for one more question.
One more question, but just wanted to echo off what Paulina has said, and unless you've been living under a rock, you might have missed her, but just speaking exactly on being asked asinine questions quite often, is the Olympian Eileen Gu, that I don't know if folks have actually said, I'm like absolutely fangirling on her, but she does the most epic takedowns for men reporters, asking her questions that should make them like dig 10 feet underneath the ground and bury themselves. So if you haven't looked up her before, look her up. She is the new goddess in town, Eileen Gu. Yeah, we've got a question here.
One last one.
I just want to take this opportunity first to appreciate every woman in this room. I'm from Toronto. And I did work with Toronto Housing. So I did have a lot of challenges when I came to Canada in 1988. The question is, when we came, they were asking, and we came with all our education certificates and everything. So everything you guys are talking, we've been experienced, and I think we are, many of us here went through that. They're asking, do you have Canadian experience? So when we work back home, offices, CEOs, doctors, lawyers, there's a rules and regulation. And when up to now, I live since 1988 up to today, very proud African Canadian, right? And I'm proud of my daughter here too. You guys are raising her very well. It is how can we manage to continue, because so many newcomers are coming. And we need to educate ourselves. How can we manage to answer those questions clearly? Because some of them, they give up when they get, you have Canadian experience. With all my certificate, I went to start grade 9 here in Canada, back again. I start everything fresh, so now I can challenge proper when they ask me those kind of questions. But we need to duplicate ourselves across the world, Canada-wide. So because I know, like our sister here, Indigenous, I work with Indigenous in Toronto, and they teach me a lot, and I learn a lot. Even we came to Whistler to open the grand opening. So I just want to understand that how can we manage to answer in different ways so other women too, they can benefit. Thank you.
I'll jump in on this, and I just think that having more opportunities to share stories in places like this, to have that one-to-one relationship, to understand how we can lift the voices of people around us. And we're given titles, It is so easy to say, oh, with this title, now I can do power over versus power among. And if we really, truly want to be leaders of the future, it's power among. So it's how do I support you in bringing your power to the table?